Okay, today's daf is Samach Zayin. We're going to start on Samach Vav, Amud Bet. Towards the bottom, we are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines, right where the wide lines begin. The widest lines on Samach Vav Amud Bet, where it says Ashkachan Tamidu Pesach Tedachu Shabbat Tedachu Tumah Minalan. So the question is like this. We know the Korban Tamid is brought every day of the year, including Shabbat. Pesach, if the Korban Pesach needs to be brought on Shabbat, it's brought on Shabbat as well. So that means that they're both Didachu Shabbat, right? They both push off Shabbat. What about Tum'ah? What that means to say is, if the majority of the Jewish people are Tameh, then we bring the Korban Pesach Bitum'ah. Even though the majority, in other words, we suspend the laws of Tum'ah. Because if an individual is Tameh and can't bring the Korban Pesach, then he waits for Pesach Sheni. But if the entire Tzibur is Tameh, the rule of Tum'ah doesn't apply anymore. So how do we know that that's also true for the Korban Tamid? That the daily offering, if the entire Jewish people is Tameh, then that means that even the Kohanim can bring it Bitum'ah, in a state of Tum'ah. They don't have to worry about being Tahor. Because those laws only apply when the majority of the people are pure. But when the majority are Tameh, the rules of Tum'ah are suspended, so to speak, for the regular Korbanot. So, Minalan, how do we get this? Amrei ki hechi, di yalif Pesach mitamid, le'inyan Shabbat, hachinami, yalif tamid mi Pesach le'inyan Tum'ah. Just like we learn from the Korban Tamid. The Korban Tamid, it says explicitly, is brought even on Shabbat. It overrides Shabbat because it involves shechita, it involves slaughtering, it involves cooking, all kinds of violations of Shabbat. We suspend Shabbat because of the Korban Tamid. We derived a connection to the Korban Tamid and said similarly, when the Korban Pesach needs to be brought and Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbat, we bring the Korban Pesach and we reverse. We learn the halacha that the Korban Tamid can be offered even bitumah, from the fact that the Korban Pesach can be offered bitum'ah. So now the Gemara asks that Upesach gufei minalan. How do we know that the Korban Pesach can be offered in a state of tum'ah? Which means to say, how do we know that if the majority of the Jewish people are tameh, that we don't have to worry about people who are tameh offering the Korban Pesach and eating it? How do we know that that's true? Amar Rabbi Yochanan said, the Amar Kra, because the pasuk says, Ish ki yihyeh tameh lanefesh. Ish nidchal lePesach sheni, ve'en tzibur nidachin lePesach sheni. It says, if a man is tameh at the time that he's supposed to bring the Korban Pesach, then we push him off to Pesach sheni, implying that it's only an individual thing. If that individual is tameh, but if the whole tzibur, if the whole community is tameh, then we don't push them off to Pesach sheni. We say, Pesach, everyone can bring it on the first Pesach, even though they're Tameh. Why? Because the rule of not offering the Korban Pesach when you're Tameh is only when when the majority of the Jewish people are Tahor, and those individuals who are Tameh are the exception. But when when the main body of the Jewish people is Tameh, Hashem does not impose on us the rule of not bringing the Korban Pesach in the state of Tumah.
Is that or is that from what we learned where it says, if a man, blah, blah, blah?
Well, because it's identifying an individual being pushed off. So we infer from that if the entire community is Tameh, then the rule doesn't apply. Because it's a matter of... Right.
Why can't you say that all individuals will just not do it and then...
No individuals will do it and they just won't have it.
Right.
Then right. So apparently the institution of Korban Pesach, in other words, what the Torah is telling you by saying that only an individual is pushed off the Pesach Sheni is that what the Chachamim are understanding is that the whole institution of Korban Pesach Rishon is never going to be canceled that year. And if the majority of if everybody is Tameh, then they would have to cancel it. And that's never going to happen. So therefore, if the majority are Tameh, we already just forget about the rule of Tumah because we don't want the whole Korban Pesach to be canceled that year. Okay, so going further. Okay. Ela avdei betumah. So Amar le Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, le Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says to Rabbi Yochanan, Ema ish nirchala Pesach sheni tzibur let lo takanta lo b'Pesach Rishon v'lo b'Pesach sheni. Why can't we say like Ari says? Ari says, why don't we just say you know what? If you're an individual, you can make up for the missed Korban Pesach on Pesach Sheni. And if it's the whole tzibur, sorry, too bad for you. You can't do anything. You don't get to do Pesach Rishon and you don't get to do Pesach Sheni. How do you know that it means that you can do Pesach Rishon even though you're Tameh? Maybe what it means is nobody gets to do Pesach that year. Right. Pesach Rishon. Because we're all Tameh. Maybe.
What are they talking about? Are they talking about Met or Tumah?
Any kind of Tumah, doesn't matter.
So today, everybody, it's not.
Nobody would be right. So let's say it's Pesach now, and let's say it's Erev Pesach right now, and the Beit HaMikdash falls out of the Shemayim, and right now we're all standing here and we're all Tameh. So the halacha would be that the Pesach can be brought b'tumah. It can be brought b'tumah. Right. That's the rule. Now, if the majority is tahor and you are an individual who's tamei, then you can't. But if the tzibur is, then they can. Now, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish is asking a question. He says, why don't we just say, if the whole tzibur is tamei, sorry, too bad for you. There's only a makeup opportunity for the individual. Meaning to say that tzibur loses out completely if they don't have the opportunity to bring it that year. So Ella Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, rather Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says, he agrees with the halacha, by the way. He just disagrees with the derivation. He says that derivation from the words ish, that an individual whose tamei is pushed off to Pesach Sheni, you can't prove from that the tzibur isn't pushed off. Because maybe the tzibur, maybe the community is cancelled altogether when they're all tamei.
Or isn't the community just the aggregate of individuals?
It doesn't look at it that way. They're not operating with that assumption. Let's put it that way. So he says, Mehacha. We learn it from here. V'shalechu min ha'machaneh kol tzarua v'chol zav v'chol tamei lanafesh. It says that you're supposed to send out of the camp every tzarua. Tzarua is somebody who has tzara'at. Any zav, a zav is somebody who has some kind of emission. It's not a natural emission from their genital area, but it's an unhealthy kind of a sickness.
How would we know that somebody?
We don't know. They have to know.
So
he has to send himself. Yeah, he has to know. And any tamei lanafesh, we also don't know if somebody's tamei met. They have to tell us. Maybe he touched a dead body, he didn't tell you. So you can't always know. So he has to be sent out. Now, yomar tamei nefesh. Ve'al yomar zavinu mitzora'in, v'ani omer im tme'em metim mishtalachin zavinu mitzora'in l'kol sheken. Now, why does the Torah have to tell us? Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish asks. It gives us three categories of tamei people who are sent out of the camp. Tamei emet, people who are tamei because they had contact with dead bodies. Zavin, people who have this emission coming out of their body. And tzarua, right? The person who is mitzorah. So that. Right, mitzvah could be seen, but it could be under your shirt. You could wear a shirt. Won't see. So he says, why do you need all three cases? If I knew that now, if I were to ask you what's the most severe of these tumot, most people think, of course, the most severe is tumat met, right? But it's only the most severe in certain respects. But actually, it's considered less severe
because the other one
comes from the body itself.
Not contaminated. Can be.
Because you're up to
because of disease.
Right, but a zav could not. Right, a zav could not. So the reason the Gemara gives why it's worse is because it comes from your body. In other words, tumat met, even though it's very severe, it's coming from an outside source. You touch the dead body, you became tameh, but you're secondary. Okay? When you're a mitzorah, it's your own body is the source of tumah. When you're a zav, it's your own body is the source of tumah. So it's worse. So Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says, if the Torah told us, send out the people who had contact with the dead, not dead people don't have halachot. Right? When you're the source of tumat met, you're not alive to tell about it. Okay? So mitzorah and zav, on the other hand, they're the source of the tumah. So we would know kal v'chomer, they would be sent out. So why? There you go. So why does the Torah have to tell you all three? Ella, we turn to Samach Zayin Amud Aleph. Ella yesh lecha she'ah shezavinu mitzorah in mishtalachin ve'en tme'em metim mishtalachin ve'ezeh pesach haba b'tum'ah. What is that? Rather, it's to tell you that there's a circumstance in which mitzorah in are sent out of the Beit HaMikdash. Zavin are sent out of the Beit HaMikdash, but me'emetim, people who are tamei from the dead body, are allowed in. And when is that? Pesach haba b'tum'ah. So he's saying that there's a proof from here. In other words, there's a situation where if I only knew that me'emetim weren't allowed in the Beit HaMikdash, then there's a situation where I wouldn't have that concept. Why not? Because when a Pesach comes b'tum'ah, when even people who are Tamei Emet are allowed to come in and bring the Korban Pesach, then I won't have a reason to exclude Zavim and Mitzora'in. So the Pasuk tells me all three cases. Why does it tell me all three cases? Because there's a case where one of them doesn't apply. Where the Tamei Emetim are allowed in the Beit HaMikdash. When are they allowed in? When the Pesach comes b'tum'ah. But Zavim and Mitzora'in are not, as we're going to see. Okay? They're not. Only Tamei Emetim are.
What does that mean?
What that means is if you touch the dead body, you become Tamei. You're called Tamei Met. If you're a Zav, that means that there's a fluid coming out of your body that makes you Tamei. If you're a Mitzorah, that means you have spots on your skin that make you Tamei. Right? So then you're never allowed to bring a
So
korban.
the one who touched the dead body can come in?
Normally he can't, but if everybody in the whole Jewish people were all Tamei from touching a dead body, then they would be allowed to come. To bring the Korban Pesach.
Is it the row
Yeah.
or is it
The majority.
So even 50.
Even 51%. 51% they would suspend it. Yeah, so that's Pesach Haba B'tumah. So Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish gives us a different source. He gives us the source, this pasuk that specifies three categories of Tumah. Why do you need all three categories? To tell you that there's a case where Tamei Emet are considered different than the others. So now the Gemara asks, Abaye says, Amar Abaye, Iyach, if that's true, Lemanami Yomar Zav Utme Emetim, Vial Yomar Mitzorah. Van Yomer Zav Mishtaleach Mitzorah Lo Kol Sheken. But according to your logic, why are you satisfied with explaining the case of the Tamei Met? But then there's still two additional cases. What are the two additional cases? The Zav and the Mitzorah. Why do you need both of those? Maybe Abaye says we should say Zav and Mitzorah alone, Zav and Tamei Emet, and you still don't need Mitzorah. Right? Because Mitzorah certainly. In other words, if I knew Tamei Emet and I knew Zav, so I know one case where the Tumah comes from an outside source, when I touch the dead body. And I know one case where the Tumah comes from my own body. So why do I also need Mitzorah in the Pasuk? There's no reason for that. Right? There's no reason for that. So what's the reason for the additional case? Ela yesh lecha sha'a shemitzora'in mishtalachayin ve'en zavin utmei metim mishtalachayin ve'eze ze pesach haba b'tumah. So then what are you going to conclude, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish? You're going to conclude that not only people who are Tamei Emet, but also people who are Are Zavim, are going to be allowed into the Beit HaMikdash for bringing the Korban Pesach. Because otherwise, how do you explain there are three cases in the pasuk. Two of them are superfluous, not just one. So if you're going to say that the superfluous case is to teach you that case is allowed when the entire Jewish people, or when the majority of the Jewish people are Tamei, that they're allowed to bring the Korban Pesach, so then you need two. You're going to have to say that for both of them. And vechi tema, and maybe you'll say hachinami that it's true. But we learned in the Mishnah, Zavim v'Zavot. I'm sorry, Pesach haba b'tumah lo yochelu mimenu Zavim v'Zavot nidot v'yoledot ve'machlu peturin. That Pesach haba b'tumah, it says in the Mishnah that when you have this special case that the majority of the Jewish people are Tamei and bring the Korban Pesach, it says still Zavim v'Zavot nidot v'yoledot. In other words, people who have the situation of ziva, where they have this flow coming from their genitalia that makes them tameh, or a nida, a regular menstruant, or a yoledet, a woman who gave birth, they still can't eat the Korban Pesach. It's only people who became tameh from an outside source who have this special dispensation, that when the majority of the Jewish people are tameh, they could bring the Korban Pesach. But if the majority of the Jewish people are nida and zava, they wouldn't be allowed to bring it. It's only Tamei Emet. Right? It's only when the majority of the Jewish people are Tamei from an outside source. So what do you see? So Abaye is lodging a question here. He says, but according to you, now it mentions, by the way, that they can't eat from the Korban Pesach, the Zav and the Zava and all that, but they're patur, they're exempt if they do, because it's already Tamei anyway. Because it was handled by people who are Tamei Emetim. Right? But anyway, the point is that they are not allowed to. So what does Abaye say? He says you can't have your cake and eat it too. If the superfluous cases in the pasuk are cases that have a special dispensation in Korban Pesach, then you're going to have to say that both Tamei Emet and Zavim when the majority of the Jewish people are Tmei Emet, when the majority of the Jewish people are Zavim, they're allowed to bring Korban Pesach. And if you're going to tell me it's not true about Zavim, which it isn't, so then that means that pasuk is not coming to teach you anything about Korban Pesach. Because either it applies to both cases or it applies to none. So Abaye is showing you cannot use that pasuk to teach you about the case of Korban Pesach, because if you do, you're going to have to apply that special dispensation also to the Zav, and it's not applicable to the Zav. So that, therefore, Abaye says it's no good. Rather, Ela Amar Abaye Leolam Mikra Kama. We have to go back to the original proof text, which was Ish, right? Ish ki yatameh lenefesh. Only an individual is pushed off the Pesach Sheni, not the community. So then, im ken nechtov rachmana ish ki yatameh lenefesh. I'm sorry, ish ki yatameh. Right? So he says, if it wanted to teach us any tum'ah, so then it would say just ki yatameh lenefesh lamali. Why does it mention a person who's tameh lenefesh specifically? Why does it mention specifically a person who's tameh met, who became tameh from a dead body? Maybe you'll tell me the reason why the Torah specifies tameh lenefesh is because that hatameh metu denidcha lePesach sheni aval shar tamein lo. Maybe you'll tell me it's because only an individual who's tameh met can make it up on Pesach Sheni, but other kinds of tum'ot cannot make it up on Pesach Sheni. That's not true. Vatanya, yachol lo yu osin Pesach Sheni elat me'emetim v'shaya b'derech rechuka zavinu mitzorinu bo'alei nidot minayin. What about all the other kinds of tum'ot? It only says in the pasuk tamei lenefesh. It only says that a person who's tamei from a dead body can make it up on Pesach Sheni. How do I know that a mitzorah can, a zav can, bo'alei nidot, somebody who had relations with a nidah can? Talmud lomar ish. That's why it says any kind of person who's tamei. So therefore, la nefesh tekatav rachman alamali elachi kamar. Ish nincha lePesach Sheni, vein tzibur nincha lePesach Sheni. Ela avdi betuma, v'chi avdi tzibur betuma betmeh met. Aval shar tumot lo avdei. So now I'm going to summarize this whole reasoning here. So what does he basically say? So he takes the pasuk and he says, the pasuk specifies what? What is the case of Pesach Sheni in the Torah? Ish ki yatameh lenefesh. When a person's tamei lenefesh, he's tamei for a dead body. What is the case in Bahalotecha? The people come and they say, "Anachnu tmeim lenefesh adam." Right? They're tamei lenefesh. So in the Torah, the explicit case is tamei lenefesh. So what might you infer from that? Oh, therefore, only somebody who's tamei lenefesh can make it up on Pesach Sheni. But let's say I'm a zav on Pesach. So then, that's not lenefesh. So maybe I can't bring Pesach Rishon, and I also can't bring Pesach Sheni because Pesach Sheni is only for somebody who was tameh lenefesh. So Abaye says that's not true because it says in the Braita, any person who was tameh on Pesach Rishon can make it up on Pesach Sheni. Anybody. So if you were a zav, mitzorah, it doesn't matter. So that can't be the reason why the pasuk specifies tamei lenefesh, right? Hold on. It can't be the reason why it specifies tamei lenefesh. Why not? Because it's not specifically somebody who's tamei lenefesh. Any tamei person can make it up on Pesach Sheni. So why then does the Torah tell you tamei lenefesh specifically? To tell you that an individual who's tamei lenefesh is pushed off to Pesach Sheni. But when the majority of the Jewish people are Tme'im Lenefesh, they can bring the Korban Pesach even Betumah. Now, if the majority of the Jewish people were Zavim, would they be able to bring the Pesach Betumah? No. If the majority of the Jewish people were Mitzoraim, would they be able to bring the Pesach Rishon Betumah? No. It doesn't explain why, okay? But only when the Tumah comes from an external source. Okay? That's the Gezerat HaKatuv. It's not teaching you something about individuals' ability to make up the Pesach in Pesach Sheni. That applies to any kind of Tumah. It's telling you something about when the majority, that's why it says, Ish ki tamei lenefesh. When an individual is tamei lenefesh, he has to wait till Pesach Sheni. When the entire Jewish people, or the majority of the Jewish people, are tamei lenefesh, then they can make the Pesach even Betumah. You have Prada glasses. That's very chashuv.
Yeah. How would that work in this case?
Oh, that's very hard.
Wait.
Because it's external, isn't it?
It's internal. Nida comes from the person.
No, nida.
Oh, the bo'alei nida. So it's a bo'el nida only. Somebody who has relations with the nida has the same status as a nida. Touching a nida, no.
How are we learning two things from one pasuk?
We're not. What are we learning from one pasuk?
We're learning about who could bring individual and who could bring majority.
Well, he's
and also, how does that follow that? If it says Talmei Nefesh, that means
Ish ki tamei lenefesh. When the individual is tamei lenefesh, he makes it up next time. If the entire tzibur is tamei lenefesh, they can do it even now.
That's second.
That's the implication of it, because it's not saying an individual; it's saying the tzibur. See, it seems like I would say this is a sugya that exemplifies what the Rambam says. That many times when the rabbis looked for a pasuk, they already had the tradition; they knew what the halacha was. Nobody disputes the halacha that when the majority of the Jewish people are tamei, that they can be makriv b'tumah. Everybody agrees. They're just trying to find a proof. So they're looking for a remez, they're looking for a hint in the pasuk. So the hint in the pasuk is that when it says ish kiyat tamei lenefesh, that an individual who's tamei can make it up on Pesach Sheni, and we know that mentioning lenefesh, mentioning that he's tamei from a dead body is not necessary, because any kind of tumah, you can still make it up on the second Pesach. So why does it mention lenefesh? To tell you the opposite. To tell you that when the tzibur is tamei lenefesh, they can still bring the korban Pesach. Why that is, you can speculate philosophically. I'm not sure.
It's not
right.
It's
not, no, because it's ish is referring to the individual, and they're inferring that means that when the tzibur is in that situation, they're allowed to. That's what they're saying. Okay, that's the inference. Now, Amar Rav Chisda says, Mitzorah shenichnas lifnim mimechitzato patur. Rav Chisda says, if a mitzorah comes into the area he's not allowed to enter, lifnim mimechitzato, he is exempt, he is patur. Now, what we need to know, a little introduction to the upcoming piece, is that in the Midbar, there were 3 areas of Kedusha. Be careful. There was something called Machaneh Shekhinah. That's the actual area of the Mishkan. There's something called the Machaneh Liviyah, which means the area of the Levi'im that was around the Mishkan. They were around the Mishkan, Saviv, right? And then there's what's called Machaneh Yisrael, which was around Machaneh Liviyah. Because we know the Beit HaMikdash was in the center, the Mishkan was in the center, around it was Levi'im, and another circle around that was the Jewish people. So the Mitzorah is sent out from all 3 camps. He can't come into the Machaneh Yisrael, he can't come into Machaneh Liviyah for sure, he can't come into the Machaneh Shekhinah. Right. Now, what was the analogy to this? How did this apply halachically in so-called modern times when they were in Israel? The way that it was applied was, the precincts of the Beit HaMikdash is Machaneh Shekhinah. Har HaBayit is Machaneh Liviyah, the surrounding area of the Mishkan, and Yerushalayim, the walled city of Yerushalayim, is Machaneh Yisrael. Okay? So a Mitzorah has to be outside all 3 of those. Okay? Somebody who is, as we're going to see, of a lesser level of Tumah might be allowed in on Har HaBayit, but not in the Beit HaMikdash. Okay? Or might be allowed in Yerushalayim, but not on Har HaBayit. We'll see. Okay? Now, when you're a Mitzorah,
is this the new Harabite, the bigger Harabite, or the old Harabite?
The same one. They only have one.
They made it bigger though.
Maybe they expanded it, but So whatever had the Kedusha of Harabite. So the Mitzorah who goes into the area he's not allowed to. In other words, he enters the Israelite camp in the Midbar, or he enters the walls of Jerusalem, or the walls of any one of the walled cities in Israel. He's not allowed to. So, what happens to him? So Rav Chisda says patur. He doesn't get malkut. He doesn't get whipped for that. In other words, there's no consequence. It's a violation. He's not allowed to, but he doesn't get punished for it. Why? Shene'emar, badad yeshev mechutz lamachaneh moshavo. That it says he should sit alone. Outside of the camp is his dwelling place. Badad yeshev Levado yeshev. Okay, what does that mean? It means that he should sit out. When it says badad yeshev, it means he should sit alone. michutz lamachane moshavo, and then it says michutz lamachane moshavo, outside the camp should be his dwelling. That's redundant, right? If we said badad yeshev, he sits alone, it means he's outside, he's away from everybody. So what does it mean? Michutz lamachane moshavo, hakatuv nitiko la'aseh. The Torah connected it to a positive commandment. We have a rule that whenever you have a negative commandment where there's a positive way to fix it, for example, if you steal, you can return it. So it's a negative commandment that's shenitak la'aseh. The negative is connected to a positive. We don't give corporal punishment. We don't give them malkot for doing the avera because they can fix what they did by correcting the problem. So if the mitzorah comes into the camp where he's not supposed to be, he can fix the problem by going back out. Alright, there's no permanent damage done. And therefore, he doesn't get malkot for coming in. So says Rav Chisda. However, the Gemara asks, wait a second, we're going to raise an objection to this because it says mitzorah shenichnas lefnim b'mechitzato ba'arba'im. It says that if the mitzorah comes in where he's not allowed, he gets 40 lashes. That's exactly the opposite of what Rav Chisda just told us. Vit utmemet mutar lekenes l'machane leviyah.
What is 40 lashes?
That means lashing you on the back. Like that. Okay? So it's the mitzorah who comes in and gets lashes. The tamemet person is allowed. Zavin v'zavot shenichnesu lefnim b'mechitzatan b'arba'im. Similarly, zavin and zavot who come into the area that they're not allowed to be get 40 lashes. Utmemet mutar lekenes l'machane leviyah v'lo tmemet bilvad amru el afilu met atzmo shenemar vayikach Moshe et atzmot Yosef imo b'mechitzato. So you have 3 levels here of tumah. The first level is zavim v'zavot. I'll start from the least severe. So the least severe is tmemet, which is ironic because we always think the tumah is the most stringent. But tmemet is not allowed in the Beit HaMikdash. Okay, but he's allowed on Har HaBayit. There's no prohibition of the tamemet person going on Har HaBayit. We're not talking about in the Kodesh HaKodeshim area, obviously. We mean we're talking about around. Okay, which would have been, the analogy would have been to the Levite camp in the times of the Midbar. The Zavim and Zavot are not allowed in the Levite camp even, meaning they wouldn't be allowed on Har HaBayit, but they're allowed in the Machane Yisrael. They're allowed in the Jewish camp, which means they would be allowed in the city of Jerusalem. And finally, the Mitzorah is not even allowed there. He's completely mishulach. He's completely sent out. Okay? Now, what this Braita is telling you, though, is that if a Tamemet person goes in a place he's not allowed to go, we do whip him. If Zavim and Zavot go in a place they're not allowed to go, we do whip them. So what about what and if a Mitzorah goes in a place he's not allowed to go, we whip him. So why does Rav Chisda tell us the opposite? Why did Rav Chisda say that? No, since he can fix it by going back out, we don't hold him responsible, or we don't punish him for doing what he wasn't supposed to do. And what's the proof, by the way? It says, afilu met atzmo. Even a dead body itself can go into Machane Leviyah, can go into the Levite camp. How do we know that? Because Moshe Rabbeinu had the bones of Yosef with him all the time. It says, vayikach Moshe et atzmot Yosef imo b'mechitzato. Even in his own area, he kept the bones of Yosef. So we see that there's no problem with Tumat Met, even in Machane Leviyah, even in the Levite camp. Now, what does the Gemara answer? Tanaihi. It's actually a machloket Tanaim. There was a machloket between the Tanaim about this issue of whether we should punish a person who's tameh for coming into an area that's a restricted area for them. And where do we see the machloket? We see it as follows: that Detanya, as we learned in a Braita, badad yeshev levado yeshev. When it says badad yeshev, it means he should sit alone. The mitzorah should sit alone. The person who has tzara'at. Shelo yutmein ahirim yoshevin imo. That even other tameh people do not sit with him, which is a way of saying he's so far removed, he's more removed from the camp than any other tameh person. Any other tameh person is allowed to be in Jerusalem, or they're allowed to be in the Machane Yisrael. They're allowed to be in the Levite camp, some of them. But nobody has to go as far as the Mitzorah. The Mitzorah is the most removed. And Yachol Yehu Zavin Utmei Metim Mishtalachain LaMachane Achat. Maybe you'll think the Mitzorah is sent out all the way. He's sent out completely outside of the camp, right? Completely outside of the city of Jerusalem, let's say. But maybe you'll think that Zavim and Tme'emet are the same level. That both of them maybe could be in the city of Jerusalem only, but they can't be in the Machane Leviyah or wherever. You would think that they could go to the same place. Answer is no. That Talmud Lomar velo yitameu et machanehem. It says they shouldn't defile their camps in the plural. What does it mean, their camps? What that means is there are three different camps. There's the place where the Mitzorah goes, and then the Zav and the Tamemet have each one of them a respective camp. So there are three levels, Rabbi Yehuda says. Rabbi Shimon Omer Eno Tzarich. Rabbi Shimon says you don't need that pasuk. You don't need this analysis to figure out that there are three camps. I'll tell you something simple. It says, send out of the camp any tzarua, meaning any person who has tzara'at, any zav, anybody who has this emission coming from their body, and anybody who had contact with a dead body. That's already three categories. Yomar tmei emet val yomar tmei zav. Vani omer tmei emetim mishtalachein zavin lo kol sheken. Lama nemar zav liten lo machane shniya. V'yomar zav val yomar mitzorah vani omer zavin mishtalachein mitzorah lo kol sheken. Lama nemar mitzorah liten lo machane shlishit. So what does Rabbi Shimon say? Rabbi Shimon says you don't need to first show that the Mitzorah is in a category by himself, and then to show that Zav and Tmemet are in two different categories. You don't need to do that. Because they're listed in the Pasuk. Send out every Mitzorah, every Zav, every Tamei Lanafesh. And we can learn from that there are three different categories. Because if it just wanted to tell you that they're all lumped in one category, it could have mentioned Tmemet. And we would know Zav, of course, because Zav is even more stringent. And if it mentioned just Zav, we would have known Mitzorah because it's even more stringent. Why does it mention all three? To tell you that each one has its own level of stringency. Mitzorah is the most removed, Zav is the second most removed, and Tememet is the least removed. And therefore, why do we need this extra pasuk then that Rabbi Yehuda used? Keshu Omer Badad Yeshev. Why does it then have to say about the Mitzorah Badad Yeshev, that he sits alone? If we already know that the Mitzorah is in a category of his own, why does it have to say that? To tell you, Akatuv Nitiko Le'aseh. To show you something even further, that if the Mitzorah trespasses on his quarantine and he comes out into the main area, he comes into the Machane Yisrael, there's a positive mitzvah to correct his transgression. He just goes back out. The extra pasuk comes to tell you that he can fix his mistake. You don't have to punish him. Okay, that's why it says Badad Yeshev. It emphasizes, let him sit alone. Meaning if he does come in, send him back out. And that's how you fix it. Don't whip him, don't punish him. So that's what the extra pasuk. So what do you see? Rabbi Yehuda uses the pasuk of Badad Yeshev just to teach you that the Mitzorah is completely removed from all three camps. So he doesn't have an extra pasuk to show you, to redeem, so to speak, the Mitzorah from being punished if he comes into the camp. So he would have to punish him. Rabbi Shimon already figured out that there are three camps. So the extra pasuk, he can come and say, oh, that protects the Mitzorah. If he messes up, he doesn't get punished. Very nice. Okay, so we see it's a machloket Tanaim then, if we're going to punish him or not. But now the Gemara goes to something. You mentioned that the Zav is more stringent than the Tmemet. How so? Prove it. How is that so? Are you saying the reason is because the Zav, his Tumah emerges from his own body. Tmemet, he touches the body outside himself. If that's true, but Adrabah will say the opposite. Tmemet Hamur. Tmemet is more stringent. This is what we normally think. Why? Think of the process of purification from being Tmemet. It's much more stringent. You have to go through a Zav, he just has to go and immerse himself. But at Tmemet, what does he have to do? He has to have a third day para aduma, third day, seventh day immersions, all this. He has a much longer process. So how can you say that from telling me Tmemet, I'm going to know automatically Zav? That's not true. Maybe Tmemet is more stringent than Zav. Because Zav doesn't have the complicated process of purification that a Tmemet does. So what does the Gemara answer? Amar Kra, the pasuk tells you v'chol tamei lanafesh. Why does it say v'chol tamei? Why is the extra word v'chol? Lirabot temesheretz, to teach you even a temesheretz. Why is somebody who becomes tamei from a dead animal a temesheretz? One of these animals that transmits tumah. Why does it have to mention that in connection with the tmemet? Why are they similar? Because in both cases you contract the tumah from something external to yourself. So v'chol tamei lanefesh means not just if you're tamei from a dead human body, but even if you're tamei from A sheretz, a dead sheretz. And a dead sheretz, does that have the complicated purification process? No. So if it said v'chol tamei lenefesh, it includes not just the becoming tamei from the dead human body, but even from the dead sheretz. And therefore, Rabbi Shimon said, kal v'chomer zav. Certainly, tamei sheretz is not as stringent as zav, because tamei sheretz doesn't have the complicated purification of tamei met.
You pick up the shirt and you go to the mikveh.
And you're done. One day. Simple. So from so if the Torah had just mentioned tamei lanefesh, and it meant not only tamei lanefesh adam, but also tamei from a sheretz, then certainly we can infer from that zav and mitzorah and all the other tumot, right? Certainly. That's what Rabbi Shimon meant. So now the Gemara says, "V'zav chamurt mitmei sheretz." You're telling me that a zav is more stringent than tmei sheretz, but umay chumrei. What makes it more stringent? Kida amaran. You're telling me that the reason why it's more stringent is why? Because zav, the tumah comes from your body. Sheretz, the tumah comes from outside, right? And now we don't have the para aduma anymore because we're dealing with somebody who becomes tamei from an animal. So adirabba, sheretz chamor. No, I'll tell you, sheretz is worse. Really? How are you going to argue sheretz is worse than zav? How could that be? Answer, sheken mitameh be'ones. Because if you touch a sheretz, let's say there's a dead rodent, whatever it is, one of these dead creatures that, whatever it is, a weasel, whatever it is that makes you tameh, you touch it. Even if you didn't know, you sat down, you thought you were putting your arm around your pet, your pet rat, and it's dead. Okay, it was be'ones. It wasn't on purpose. You had no idea it was dead. So it's be'ones, and still you're tameh. It doesn't matter. Amri bazav, you can't apply. Amri ki'ai gavna. I'm sorry, I'm skipping to the answer. So it says, what's the chumrah? We could say that a sheretz is more chamor shekem b'tameh be'ones because it doesn't matter what the reason was that you touched the sheretz, or whether you knew that it was a dead sheretz or not. You did it. Whereas a zav, if it's be'ones, in other words, let's say you ate some very spicy food last night. You ate Moroccan food, and as a result of the Moroccan food, you had an emission of ziva. That's not ziva. That wouldn't make you a zav of the 7-day tumah of zav. Why? Because it's attributable to some stimulus other than that you have this underlying condition. What? That if you eat a food that makes your body make this fluid come out of it, okay, so that wouldn't make you tameh because it came from the thing that you ate. It doesn't come from your body. It doesn't mean that you don't have the condition, the sickness in your body that's making the fluid. Okay, so in the case of the zav, it usually has to be a condition. So if something that you ate or you did too much exercise or something caused it, that wouldn't be ziva. Whereas a sheretz, it doesn't matter what the cause is. So maybe sheretz is more stringent. Sheretz is more stringent. So just because the pasuk said sheretz, that doesn't mean I'm going to know zav. Because zav, maybe it's more lenient. And you would say, oh, why sheretz? Oh, because sheretz is very, no matter what the cause is, if you touched it, you're tameh. Zav, it's only if it comes from the underlying condition. So actually, it's more limited. So the Gemara says, no, because amrei bekiai gavna, zav nami tamuye mitame be'ones kedravuna tamaravuna reya rishona shel zav mitama be'ones. No, because really a zav, the first fluid emission that the zav has, it doesn't matter what the cause is. It's only to make him a zav at the highest level where he requires the 7 clean days. That requires that it not be from an external stimulant, like from food or something like that. But to initially have the status of zav, we don't care what the cause is. The first thing, because there's 3 levels actually of ziva. There's seeing one emission on one day that makes you what's called like a balkari. It's only a 1-day tumah. Seeing 2 days and seeing 3 days. Okay, so there are different levels of ziva. Even for a male who has this emission. So the 2nd and 3rd day, the extra stringencies of zav don't come into play unless the reason that the emission happened was because of an underlying condition that the person has. But the first day that he sees the emission, he'll be tameh, no matter what the cause is. So really it's equal. So basically sheretz and zav would be on an equal playing field, except that zav comes from inside you, And sheretz comes from outside you. So therefore, if I knew sheretz, I would kal v'chomer know zav, because sheretz and zav are on an even playing field for all other things, and zav is certainly more stringent because it comes from within the person, not from outside the person. So therefore, Rabbi Shimon's kal v'chomer works. If the Torah had just told me to make sheretz, I would definitely know zav, because they're equal in all other respects, except that zav is more stringent. It comes from the body itself. Now they ask on the second one, that my chumrei de mitzorah mizav. You also mentioned that if I only had zav, I would know mitzorah. Why is mitzorah more stringent than zav? What's the reason? You're going to tell me because sheken ta'un priya priya v'asur b'tashmish habita. Because the mitzorah has a rule of priya. He's not allowed to cut his hair. Prima. He has to tear his garment. He acts like an avel. He acts like a mourner. And he's asur b'tashmish hamita. He can't live with his wife, right? He has to live alone. And he can't sleep in the same bed as his wife, right? Tashmish hamita, he can't have relations with his wife. So, that's a greater stringency than zav. Zav doesn't have any of those rules. He doesn't have to grow his hair long. He doesn't have to tear his garment. He's allowed to live with his wife normally. So you'll say mitzorah is definitely more stringent, but Adrabah will say the opposite. Zav chamor sheken b'tamei mishkav v'moshav v'mitamei klei cheres beheset. There are actually certain rules of zav that are more stringent than mitzorah. If a zav sits on a chair, the chair gets such a stringent tuma that if somebody else sits on it, it becomes like an avatuma. If he sits on the chair and now somebody sits on the chair, it'll make the person tameh.
Can they have marital relations?
Yeah, he is. I don't know if it'll be comfortable for him, but yeah. Now the mitzorah, if he sits on a chair, from touching something he can make it tameh, but it doesn't get the status of an avatuma if he sits on it. Okay, if he were to lie down on a bed, the zav were to lie down on a bed, that bed gets a very high level of tumah.
Maybe it has to do with the fluid itself.
Well, we talked about that when we learned the psukim last year. But what the reason is, but the point is that he has a greater stringency. Or another halacha of zav is that a kli cheres, an earthenware vessel, if you touch the outside of it, if you're tameh and you touch the outside, you can't make it tameh. You have to touch the inside. However, a zav, even if he moves it without touching it directly, he'll make it tameh. So there's a great stringency to the tumah of zav that mitzorah doesn't have. So how are you assuming? Yeah, how can you assume that mitzorah is worse than zav? It's not true. Zav has a lot of stringencies himself. So the Gemara answers, Amar Kra, zav v'chol zav. It mentions Kol tzarua v'chol zav, any zav. What does v'chol zav mean? Lirabot balkeri. It means also a balkeri, not just a zav who has the full-fledged status of zav and all of these stringencies apply, but even a balkeri, somebody who has a regular emission, a regular normal emission, where the tumah is not nearly as stringent as zav, and it doesn't have any of those rules of mishkav and moshav. The person who's a balkeri doesn't make his chair tameh, he doesn't make his bed tameh. None of these other stringencies are going to be applicable. And yet the Torah is mentioning when it says v'chol zav, kol tzarua v'chol zav, v'chol tameh lenefesh, right? So if the Torah had just mentioned v'chol zav, it includes balkeri, and yet it's still saying kol tzarua. Right? So what the Gemara is saying is that if balkeri is included in zav, definitely mitzorah is more stringent than balkeri, because balkeri doesn't have any of the stringencies of zav. So if the Torah mentioned balkeri, we could certainly infer mitzorah. So just like, in other words, it did the same move that it did before. The same move that it did before by saying, tameh met doesn't just mean tameh met, it also means tameh sheretz. And zav doesn't only mean zav, because then it's not so clear that zav is less or more stringent than mitzorah. But balkeri is definitely less stringent than mitzorah. And so we say kal v'chomer, that mitzorah is going to be tameh. And the Gemara says umay chumrei, but still, how do you know? So balkeri, so lirabah balkeri, umitzorah chamor mi balkeri, umay chumrei kedamaran. So you're going to say that what makes mitzorah more stringent than balkeri? All the things we already said. The mitzorah has to grow his hair long, he can't live with his wife, he has to tear his garments. Adrabah, balkeri chamor. No, I'm going to say balkeri is more stringent. I'm not going to buy it. Why? Because even the tiniest emission from a balkeri makes him tameh. The tiniest drop. But a mitzorah, it has to be a certain size. The spot on his body has to be a certain size. So maybe really Balkari is more stringent.
No.
Titania, and no, the Gemara answers no, because Savar like Rabbi Natan. We're holding like Rabbi Natan. Titania, because Rabbi Natan said, Rabbi Natan Omer Mishum Rabbi Ishmael. Rabbi Natan said in the name of Rabbi Ishmael, Zav tzarich kahatimat pi ha'ama. That Rabbi Natan said that for a zav or balkari to become tamei, there has to be enough that the opening of the organ would be filled by it, basically. So there's a quantity. There's a quantitative measurement. It's not any tiny amount. There has to be some quantity. So it's not, the quantities are different, but the point is there's a quantitative measurement. So what we're showing is balkari is on the same level with regard to mitzorah, except that mitzorah has all these additional stringencies. Right? So therefore balkari is inferior to mitzorah. Therefore, by mentioning balkari, we would infer definitely mitzorah as well. And therefore mentioning mitzorah is superfluous, as Rabbi Shimon said. That was the argument of Rabbi Shimon. Now, the Gemara goes on and says, okay, but now we have another question. Because v'it balkari lezav. And a balkari is the same as zav. So in other words, therefore we complete the picture here. That Rabbi Shimon's argument is based on the fact that v'chol tzarua, v'chol zav, v'chol tamei nefesh means sheretz and balkari, right? And we're saying kal v'chol, you wouldn't need, since you already know sheretz, you don't need to know zav, and since you already know balkari, you don't need to know mitzorah. So they're all superfluous, and therefore we can learn out from each of the things a different idea. But now the Gemara asks one last question about this. But wait a second. That you told us v'chol zav v'chol tamei nefesh means to include not just a human dead body, but also a sheretz. Not just a zav, but also balkari. What does v'chol tzarua come to include? It also says v'chol. What's the v'chol? What's the v'chol in kol tzarua? So the Gemara answers, ID, just like it says in the pasuk. Dechtiv kol zav ketiv nami kol tzarua. You know what? We're going to say that there is no special reason for that. There's no special reason for it. Kol tzarua is just to fit in. Kol tamei nefesh and kol zav, they're to include something. But the third one isn't to include anything new. It's just to say, it's just stylistic. So therefore we don't have to include anything new from that pasuk. And now the Gemara says, Shapir ka'amar Rabbi Shimon. I'm sorry, for Rabbi Yehuda, Shapir ka'amar. But Rabbi Yehuda said something very logical. In other words, Rabbi Yehuda says that, if we go back, what was the argument of Rabbi Yehuda? What was his point? Rabbi Yehuda said that we, from the pasuk that Rabbi Yehuda quotes, Badad Yeshev, and then Machanehem, he was able to prove the three different levels that we send tamei people out to. So Rabbi Shimon will say, Hahumi ba'ele, that Rabbi Shimon is going to answer. Oh, wait a second. Who is it asking on here? 1 second. Okay. Right, so I was right the first time. So what it means is it's asking on Rabbi Yehuda. It's saying for Rabbi Yehuda, Shapir ka'amar Rabbi Shimon. Why doesn't Rabbi Yehuda accept the derivation of Rabbi Shimon? Since we see that Rabbi Shimon shows that there are three categories of tamei people. Each one has his own level that he has to be sent out. Right? Why does Rabbi Shimon's argument, why doesn't Rabbi Yehuda accept the derivation of Rabbi Shimon? Why does he have to come up with his own pasuk? Why doesn't he accept Rabbi Shimon? Because because he uses it for something else. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Yachol dahaku zavinu b'tzoraim v'nechazul azar b'pesach habab b'tumah Yachol yu chayavin Talmud Amar v'shalchom l'machane kol tzor v'chol zav v'chol tamei nefesh b'shah shemetim mishtalachin zavinu b'tzoraim mishtalachin and me'emetim mishalachin and zavinu b'tzoraim mishtalachin. So basically, what does the pasuk say? What is Rabbi Eliezer saying here? That in a case where Pesach comes bitum'ah, in a case where the majority of the Jewish people are me'emetim, right? So what happens? We know that only applies to people who are tamei met or tamei sheretz, let's say. But it doesn't apply to zavim. It doesn't apply to mitzoraim. So let's say it's Pesach, or the majority of the Jewish people are Tmei Metim, and they all go to make the Korban Pesach in the Beit HaMikdash. So one mitzorah says, hey, I'm going to go into the Beit HaMikdash too, because all these other Tamei people are going in. What difference does it make? And he goes in. So what might you think? That Mitzorah who went in, that Zav who went in, should be liable for going into the Beit HaMikdash in a state of Tumah.
Correct.
Right? So the Torah says, no, it's not true, because it says, V'shalachom min ha'machaneh kol tzarua v'chol zav v'chol tamei lanafesh, that you should send out every tzarua, every zav, and every tamei lanafesh. Meaning, only at a time where Tme'im metim are sent out of the Beit HaMikdash, are the other Tme'im also banned from the Beit HaMikdash. But once in other words, once the purity of the Beit HaMikdash is already compromised, because we're allowing the Tme'im metim in, even though the Mitzora'im and Zavim are not supposed to go in, they're not supposed to come in. But if they did, we're not going to hold them to the same level of accountability, because the tahara was already, and the purity was already compromised.
Then we say they're higher levels.
Okay? Yeah, they're worse. But we can't now turn around and say, hey, you tamei person, you came into the Beit HaMikdash, you have to bring a korban. What do you mean? Everybody else was also tamei.
But you're making it more tamei.
Right, but once you compromise, once the tahara is compromised, it's not the same level of violation anymore. That's what so he learns that from that pasuk. And therefore, since he learns that from that pasuk, he doesn't use that pasuk to tell us about the 3 levels of tumah, of separation, because he already used that pasuk to tell you that in a case where you're already compromising the purity of the Beit HaMikdash, you can't hold the other levels accountable to the same degree anymore. So therefore,
nothing kind of thing.
it's not. They're still not allowed to come in, but we don't hold them as accountable. Yeah. So he uses the pasuk for that. So we can't use that pasuk to tell you the 3 levels. So therefore, he has to go to the other psukim that he brings in order to demonstrate the 3 levels. And we'll see tomorrow, because the next piece is now going to go on to a new sugya. So we're going to end here, because the next piece goes on all the way to the middle of the next amud. So we'll save it for tomorrow.